OVU 731 de Skyjet International Airlines took off from Guarulhos International Airport on a clear and promising morning. The passengers, a mix of tourists and business people, settled into their seats, fastening seatbelts and putting on headphones, preparing for the next 10 hours of flight to New York. The air in the cabin was filled with the expectation of a routine and peaceful journey. However, the initial calm would soon be replaced by growing tension as the flight entered international airspace. Half an hour after takeoff, one of the pilots, the experienced Captain Enrique Moreira, noticed something strange on the control panels. A low-pressure alert in one of the fuel tanks was flashing persistently. At first, Enrique considered the possibility of a minor issue, perhaps a system reading error, but his expression hardened when another alarm started to sound, this time, a failure in the hydraulic system. He exchanged a worried glance with his co-pilot, Jorge Almeida, who was already checking the systems, trying to identify the source of the problems. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers remained unaware of what was happening in the cockpit. Some were already dozing off, while others were watching in-flight entertainment. But everything changed when the seatbelt warning lights came on again, and the plane began to encounter intense turbulence, causing passengers to grip the armrests, feeling the growing discomfort. Captain Enrique decided to communicate with the control tower in Sao Paulo, seeking instructions and possible solutions to the technical problem. However, as soon as he initiated contact, the communication failed, leaving them isolated, thousands of meters above the ground. The discomfort in the cockpit turned into a cold chill down their spines as they realized they were on their own. In the cabin, flight attendant Ana Paula tried to remain calm as she walked down the aisle, reassuring passengers with a professional smile, but the worry in her eyes was impossible to hide. The turbulence grew more violent, and murmurs of unease began to turn into screams of fear. Then, the cabin lights flickered and went out for a moment. The plane plunged into complete darkness, and the continuous sound of the engines was replaced by an unsettling silence. The passengers panicked, screams echoing through the cabin, as some clung to each other, trying to find an explanation for what was happening. Captain Enrique, his heart racing, struggled to keep the aircraft under control. But what no one on board knew, not even the crew, was that the technical problems were not the result of a simple mechanical failure or human error. Something more sinister was at play, something that even the most experienced pilots could not have foreseen. At the same time, in the business class, a man in a dark suit calmly stood up, ignoring the nervous glances around him. He held a small device in his hand, a cold smile spreading across his face. And in that instant, it became clear that the nightmare was just beginning. The man in the dark suit watched the panicked cabin with an unsettling calm. He pressed a button on his device, and a slight vibration coursed through the floor of the plane. It was almost imperceptible, but the more attentive passengers felt a tremor beneath their feet, as if the aircraft was being shaken by an invisible force. Panic was now giving way to absolute terror as people clung to their seats, silently praying that this was just a nightmare. In the cockpit, Captain Enrique desperately fought to stabilize the flight. The hydraulic failure was compromising the aircraft's controls, and communication was still cut off. He had no idea that the source of the problems was just a few meters away, in the passenger cabin, where that man in the dark suit controlled every detail of the chaos unfolding. Suddenly, the aircraft's PA system came on. An irritating static noise echoed through the speakers, followed by a cold, calculating voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that your flight is now under my control. Do exactly as I say, and no one will get hurt, for now." The voice belonged to the man in the dark suit, who was now standing at the front of the business class, his gaze fixed on the terrified passengers. Flight attendant Ana Paula tried to approach him but stopped when he raised the device in his hand, a warning look in his eyes. The crew was paralyzed, unsure of how to act in such an unpredictable situation. "I'll repeat, stay calm and follow my instructions," the man continued. "Any attempt at heroism will be severely punished." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Enrique and Jorge listened to the transmission with expressions of horror. They were being hijacked, but the hijacker was unlike any other they had ever heard of. He seemed to control the plane in a way that defied logic, and his demands were still a mystery. "We need a quick solution," whispered Jorge, the co-pilot, his face pale. "If he can control the plane, what else is he capable of?" Enrique agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that every passing second was crucial and that the lives of everyone on board depended on his next actions. But before they could formulate a plan, the hijacker's voice echoed through the speakers once again. "Captain, I know you're listening. Disable all security systems now, or you'll see what happens when someone tries to defy my orders." Enrique felt a chill run down his spine. How did this man know what was happening in the cockpit? How was he able to control the aircraft without being inside? It was as if he was one step ahead of them, predicting their every move. The captain hesitated, knowing that complying with the demands could mean putting everyone at risk, but disobeying could have even more terrible consequences. As the tension on board grew, a passenger in the economy class began to stir. She was a middle-aged woman with tired features but a determined look in her eyes. Marta, a former federal police agent, was on her first international flight in years. She had left her career behind, but her instincts and training were far from forgotten. Observing the chaos around her, she knew she needed to act, but the risk was enormous. Every move had to be calculated, every decision precise. And so, as the plane shook amidst the growing turbulence and fear turned into despair, Marta prepared to do the one thing she knew how to do: face danger, even if it meant putting her life on the line. She just needed a plan. Marta carefully observed the man in the dark suit, analyzing each of his movements and expressions. Her experience told her that he wasn't just a common hijacker. He possessed a coldness and absolute control that didn't match the typical profile of a desperate criminal. There was more at stake, something she needed to discover before acting. She slowly stood up, pretending to retrieve something from the overhead compartment above her head. Her eyes scanned the cabin in search of potential allies. Identifying another person with training or someone willing to help was essential for any attempt to regain control of the situation. But from what she could see, fear had taken hold of everyone around her. No one seemed willing to take the risk. Meanwhile, the man in the dark suit continued to monitor the cabin, occasionally pressing the device in his hand, which seemed to cause new malfunctions in the plane. The lights flickered, the engines hummed irregularly, and the cabin pressure fluctuated, making it difficult for passengers to breathe. He knew exactly what he was doing, manipulating the plane as if it were a puppet. In the cockpit, Captain Enrique was in a dilemma. Increasingly convinced that the man had some kind of remote control over the aircraft's systems, he pondered whether he should obey the orders or risk a maneuver that could disable whatever was interfering with the controls. But any rash decision could result in disaster. He needed more time, but time was something he didn't have. Back in the cabin, Marta finally found what she was looking for: a small plastic knife that had fallen to the floor, probably from a passenger during the initial panic. It wasn't an ideal weapon, but it was better than nothing. She slipped the knife into her coat pocket, careful not to attract attention. Now, Marta needed a distraction. Something that would divert the hijacker's focus long enough for her to approach. Then an idea came to her. Remembering the emergency routines she had learned during her training, she knew the plane was equipped with a first aid compartment, usually located near the exits. This compartment not only contained medicines and bandages but also items like pepper spray and tasers, used in emergencies with violent passengers. If she could reach it, her chances of neutralizing the man would increase significantly. With firm but unhurried steps, Marta began to walk toward the back of the plane, pretending to be just heading for the restroom. Every step was a test of nerves. Every glance from the hijacker seemed like a blade about to drop. But he was focused on something else, his eyes on the device in his hand, calculating his next move. Marta used this to her advantage, moving with calm and precision. As she neared the back of the aircraft, the tension in her body increased. She knew she would only have one chance. The first aid compartment was just behind the last row of seats, and reaching it without drawing attention would require all of her skill. Marta paused briefly beside a flight attendant who was standing still, pale and trembling, but trying to maintain composure. "I need your help," whispered Marta, keeping her voice low. The flight attendant, surprised, looked at her with wide eyes, but Marta continued. "There's a first aid compartment back there. It might have something I can use to immobilize him. Can you create a distractee?" The flight attendant, still visibly terrified, hesitated, but something in Marta's determined gaze encouraged her. She knew she needed to act, that everyone's fate depended on her actions. "What do you want me to do, th?" "Create a commotion," Marta replied. "Maybe pretend you're having a medical emergency. We need to divert his attention, even if it's just FO." The flight attendant nodded, her lips trembling but determined. She took a deep breath and began walking towards the middle of the cabin, where the passengers were closer to the hijacker. Marta, meanwhile, continued her path to the first aid compartment. She was only a few feet away when she heard the flight ATT. "Help! Someone help me!" The flight attendant doubled over in the aisle, clutching her stomach as if in severe pain. Her performance, though hurried, was convincing enough to draw the attention of everyone, including the man in the dark suit. He frowned, irritated by the interruption, and took a few steps towards the flight attendant, Ku. This was the chance Marta had been waiting for. She slipped into the first aid compartment and quickly opened the door. Her agile fingers skimmed the shelves until she found what she was looking for, a small emergency use taser. It was discreet, easy to use, and effective in temporarily immobilizing someone. Without wasting any time, she grabbed the device and hid it in her pocket, keeping a plastic knife in her other hand as an extra precaution. With the taser in hand, Marta started moving again, approaching the hijacker from behind. The flight attendant continued her act, groaning and begging for help, while the hijacker grew increasingly frustrated with the situation. His steps now took him back toward the cockpit, ignoring Marta completely. She knew she didn't have much time. As soon as the hijacker turned to face the pilots, Marta moved closer silently and, with a quick and precise motion, pressed the taser against his back. An electric shock coursed through the man's body, causing him to stiffen and fall to the floor, the electronic device slipping from his hand. The flight attendant let out a sigh of relief, but the relief was short-lived. Even immobilized, the man still tried to reach for the device that had fallen to the floor, but Marta kicked it away, sending it sliding under a seat. The hijacker was temporarily neutralized, but the tension in the plane was still palpable. Everyone knew he wasn't acting alone, but they didn't know who else might be involved or what was going to happen next. Before Marta could relax, a sharp, desperate sound echoed through the plane's intercom system. It was the pilot's emergency warning. "All passengers, brace yourselves. We've lost control of the plane." Terror returned to the cabin as Marta stood up, desperately trying to find a solution. She didn't know that even with the hijacker neutralized, the real danger was still lurking. Something deeper, darker, was about to be revealed, and time to save everyone was running out. Marta felt her heart race as she heard the pilot's warning. The feeling of triumph from taking down the hijacker instantly evaporated, replaced by a deep, paralyzing fear. The plane, now out of control, began to lose altitude rapidly. The force of gravity pulled the bodies downward as the passengers screamed in despair. But amidst the chaos, Marta refused to give in to panic. She ran to the cockpit, pushing the door open forcefully. Inside, the pilots were desperately struggling with the controls, which seemed to respond to an invisible and insidious force. Marta saw, on a secondary screen, an image that froze her blood, a countdown clock, marking the final seconds before a likely catastrophe. "There's nothing more we can do," shouted Enrique, sweating profusely as he tried to stabilize the aircraft. But Marta didn't give up. Her mind raced for a solution. Then, in a flash of intuition, she remembered the device the hijacker was carrying. That was the key. Something in that device was controlling the plane. She ran back to the aisle, her eyes scanning the floor until she spotted the small device, still glinting under the dim cabin light. Without hesitation, Marta picked it up. The countdown on the cockpit screen blinked faster and faster. Only seconds remained. Marta frantically examined the device, looking for something that could interrupt the signal. Her hand trembled, sweat dripping down her forehead, as she pressed buttons and swiped across the device's screen, hoping to disable it before it was too late. Then, just as the countdown was about to reach 0, Marta finally found a sequence that seemed to shut down the device. She pressed the last button, and for a moment, the plane jerked violently, as if shaking off an invisible force that held it in its grip. In the cockpit, the pilots regained control, the systems began to respond, and the plane leveled out into a stable, though still precarious, flight. The cabin, which had been in absolute chaos moments before, fell silent as the passengers tried to comprehend what had just happened. Marta's heavy breathing echoed in the silence, her hands still clutching the now deactivated device. She let herself collapse into an empty seat, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion and adrenaline. In the cockpit, Captain Enrique let out a deep sigh, his eyes meeting Marta's in a silent look of relief. They had escaped by a thread, but they were safe. For now. But as the plane resumed its course to New York, Marta knew this wasn't the end. The man who had tried to bring them down was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The questions lingered in the air. Who was he? Who was behind all this? And most disturbingly, what was coming next? As Flight 731 approached its destination, Marta realized that even in safety, this journey had only just begun. The real terror was yet to come, and she knew she needed to be prepared. Because whatever was waiting for her in New York, it was only the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous.